Hello, students. Are we ready for lesson? If you have seen my YouTube where I go through warming up the voice, I would like to refer to you that way so we don't have to do that right now. Let us assume that you have already used 5-tone scales to get your voice limbered up and to get good blood flow and stretch within the system. Let us even consider that you have done your 5 and 9-tone scales that I talked to you about. And let us say that you have started those towards the base, the lower part of your voice. So for a baritone or a bass, we'd start around a low G or low F. And then we'd continue on up the scale, taking notice where the first passaggio is in your voice. If you're a lower voice, say a bass, the first passaggio will be around E natural or F, below middle C, where C is measured as C4. This would be E or F3. So for a bass, E or F3 represents the first passaggio. That is where the chest voice would normally end unless you extended it by a certain technique. So you've done these 5-tone drills. And you've been very sensitive now to the 4th and the 5th, because that's your first passaggio. Forgive me for my voice is very dried out because of medication I have to take for my heart. So the 4th and the 5th, first passaggio for the bass. The bass has to make very good certain that the diaphragm is well engaged there and that he keeps the voice round and then continues to round it further as he goes up the rest of the chest voice, which can be extended for the bass clear up to D or E flat even. So this would represent an improper negotiation of the first passaggio. I will sing that for you improperly. Again. Now that is what we would call voce aperta. It's where the vowel is brightened as you go towards the first passaggio, and the A goes towards A. The impropriety of that kind of working is called a false adjustment or an impure registration. So the real way to handle the first passaggio, there for the bass, is classic chiaro scuro, to make sure that the voice is clear and dark at the same time, and that you approach the tone with roundedness in mind and in ear. That's why I'm cupping my ear to hear it better. That would represent a proper way for the bass to negotiate the first passaggio. And then as it continues on up, So it continues to round as it goes up the scale. And it rounds until we reach the top of the second passaggio, and that's for the bass. That's around where middle C is C4. That second passaggio for the bass will be D4 or E flat 4. It's a very, very big mistake for basses to try to carry the open chest voice on up as high as a baritone. I sang with a very wonderful bass from the Metropolitan Opera in many, many different roles, especially Spada Fucile in Rigoletto and King Henry in Lohengrin, and he had a great low voice, but he tried to extend the chest voice on up as high even as an E natural or an F, and his voice always lost resonance and lost roundedness. I usually do not like to demonstrate what's wrong, but in this case, I'll do it for you. This is the wrong way for the bass to handle that area. Okay, so there's an extending of the chest voice on up where it should be a covered tone. Especially the bass sounds very, very awkward with the chest voice carried that high. So instead, the cure for that is for the bass to engage the head voice. The head voice is the same thing as head register. Voice and register mean the same thing. The head voice is the same thing as the covered voice. Cover is simply the English word for the Italian phrase or word copertura. Copertura is the noun form of a word, which means a covering, like a roof on a house or a top on a carport. It's a cover. It refers to the adjustment that has to be made by all male voices when they reach the absolute second passaggio. And that is that this is the way we phrase that entrance. That when we reach the second passaggio, we make sure the diaphragm is in the position of appoggio as it was in the chest voice, and therefore we do not have any sense at all of releasing air, more air pressure into the passaggio. So you take the breath and it feels like you rob the tone of the air. Instead, you darken the vowel. So the vowel A would be darkened. Garcia told this. Towards O. It wouldn't get there. Some basses overdo it and give this auga effect. We don't want that. So we want something like this. I'm not a bass, but it would be something like this. If we just start, we'll do the octave. So there, the last two tones, the E and the F, were covered. The head voice is to change in timbre. And if the bass can sing higher than an F, no guarantee for that with basses. Many basses don't have higher than an F or an F sharp. Siepi never had higher than an F sharp. On the other hand, a bass like Flagello had a high A flat. So there's variance with basses, but classically basses tend to stop with F or F sharp. Hines had a thrilling, wall-busting high G, but he did not have an A flat. But he certainly had an ample F and F sharp. So once again, if we looked at the bass, the ah has neutralized a little bit in the direction of O, but it hasn't gotten there. Were we to sing an O vowel in the passaggio, we would have to do nothing at all except to hold the breath in appoggio rather than to push the breath. So the O vowel, no adjustment required, you see. No change in the shading of the vowel necessary. The same is true for the U vowel, which is the furthest back of all the back vowels. All that would be required for the U vowel would be a possible opening a little bit of the jaw a little wider, especially if you were a bass singing it forte. So if a bass again on U, not much change, you see, just a little opening of the jaw wider a little bit, and then we get the U vowel. So now that is the entrance to whatever head voice that the bass has. Usually, as I say, F sharp is the end. If a bass can sing a G, it feels very much and sounds very much like a baritonal G. So now let's go back to the baritones, and instead of starting way down here on low G, which is not a functional note for the baritone voice, even though we've got a couple of them to sing. There's one of them in Nulla Silenzio, but for the most part, even the low A is uncommon for Verdi baritones to have to sing. But we'll start there anyway, and we'll do, let's do a couple of 5-tone scales until we reach the first passaggio, which now for the baritone will be between F, F3 below middle C, or A flat 3 below middle C. There's a step and a half variance. Mine is around F. So we'll do some 5-tone scales, and you can hear how the first passaggio is managed. Let's start at C. C3. We're over it now. So you see there wasn't any major adjustment. There was simply a guarantee of roundedness. In other words, it did not sound like this, which would be called voce aperta in Italian, which is a euphemism for bad technique. It means that you have no chiaroscuro, and it means you've lost all roundedness, arrotondamento in Italiano, and arrotondamento is the essential characteristic of the adjustment for both the first passaggio and the second passaggio. If we can just remember that, we'll have fewer problems with the passaggio. So then we carry the rest of the baritone voice. We'll start at G, and as we get to there, you will hear the adjustment that enters head voice and carries the rest of the octave. So that became rather obvious, didn't it? That the tone is rounded, and that is the copertura that is the cover, that is the aggiustamento, that is the arrotondamento, that is the chiaroscuro. Now, if the baritone can sing higher than a G, no guarantee. Most lyric baritones do not have a high A flat. Occasionally some do, but say, for example, the prince of baritones, Giuseppe De Luca. How could you find a better example? And De Luca is considered the model for an Italian lyric baritone, but De Luca couldn't sing higher than a high G. You couldn't make him sing an A flat if you stuck him with a pen. So, but he had such a following, such a base of fans, that they wanted to hear him sing everything. So he would sing Rigoletto, but he wouldn't do any of the high A flats that are tradition at the ending and at the end of the Vengeance duet. He would simply sing as written. And people wanted him to sing Tonio in I Pagliacci. So, you know, by tradition, the prologue ends in a high A flat. So this was too much. He could not do that. And so instead, while the orchestra is coming down from that previous section, they simply would go down a half step more. So instead of singing, he would be singing, he would be down a half a step. So by the time he got to the climactic phrase, Al pari di voi would just go to a G, and he had a high G. And this became such a hallmark of his that even in auditions, people were doing that. This is in the 30s and early 40s. And so if you came to an audition to do for the prologue, to sing Tonio, the people would ask you, are you doing it in the original key or in the De Luca transposition? They would allow you to do it in the De Luca transposition, but they just wanted to know. Obviously, they would prefer that you did it in the original key and that your voice could sing a high A flat. Funny how we are so eager to make these adjustments, these transpositions for great voices that simply have one or two little flaws, perhaps. And Merrill, for example, was very comfortable singing Di Provenza, even in performance in his youth. But as he grew older, it wasn't so easy for him. And every time he concertized and put Di Provenza in the program, anything after the age of 50, he transposed Di Provenza down a whole step. So we ought not to think badly on singers who did these things, but we also ought to explore our natural limitations, our natural abilities to expand the voice, if it is a natural expansion and not one achieved by pushing. So let's hear the rest of the baritone voice as it continues over the second passaggio. Now, since I have very little breath, I had to take a quick snatch breath there at the end. But that is the octave of middle C to tenor high C. So you can see there was never any point where it no longer sounded like a baritone. If, for example, I had sung that and it sounded like there were two voices, and by the time I got to a high B flat, it sounded like a tenor was singing, then there'd be something wrong. It is possible for people to have two type voices locked within one. I knew this from a colleague who was a natural baritone and sang very nicely as a baritone, but he had this desire to be a tenor, and so he monkeyed around and jimmied up his technique to where he could sing tenor and sound like a totally different voice, totally different. But the problem is, then it really sounded like two people. Because you had the natural baritone sound, and then you had the very unnatural tenor sound, which had no color, was solid white. So I'm not referring to tricks like that when I say try to find your natural range, see how far you can naturally extend the voice. When I have enough air, which is no longer now, my voice extended up to a high D above high C. Today, I don't think I have enough air in my... All right, that has taken us up now through the first passaggio, through the second passaggio, for both for bass and baritone. The tenor voice is the most difficult one to master. It is the most fragile in terms of maintaining good appoggio with proper registration. But a great tenor voice, as everyone knows, will fill the house, will make people happy, and there's a reason why people go crazy at clapping for a great high B flat at the end of Celeste Aida, because they deserve it. Tenor arias are intentionally intended to be the really high stirring moment in the opera. Us baritones, we get only a few places where we get any of the glory that the tenor gets. In fact, my teacher Bardelli used to say, "Giuseppe, I speak it to you now frankly, if I have your voice, I become a tenor, 'cause you make more money." That was his view of it. And he took off 1 year of his career, and he was a very busy Verdi baritone. He took off 1 year of his career and reworked his voice and tried to become a tenor. And he just couldn't do it. He said, "The note that I cannot sing, oh, that high C bemole, I just could not get." And so he said to me one day, "Giuseppe, I speak it to you frankly, I'm a little jealous of you, 'cause I tell you, if I have your high B flat, I'd be the greatest tenor in the world." Well, he had to put up with the fact that he was one of the greatest Verdi baritones in the world of all time. Cesare Bardelli. I give great thanks to him. And to his teacher, Carlo Tagliabue. So my teaching comes from two lines, great distinguishment. Is that a word? A great distinguishment? I don't know if that's a word. At any rate, the line of Carlo Tagliabue came from bel canto to the back teeth. And Tagliabue taught Bardelli, Bardelli taught me. On the other side was Heinz, and Heinz was taught by a bass. What was his name? Gennaro Curci. He was the brother-in-law of Madame Gali Curci, and he had been a successful bass, and he taught everybody in Hollywood. He was called Mr. Hollywood, and it was because of all of his contacts that Jerry Hines got started in the business so successfully at such a young age. And later he told me, he said, if I hadn't had all of that help from Curci, I wouldn't have had the career that I had. So it's nice to give thanks when thanks are due. I'm thankful that I'm in their lineage of singing and teaching. Tagliabue, Bardelli, Hines, and Curci. Not a bad group to be in. The tenor, James McCracken, was a great friend of mine, Jimmy Boy. And we did Pagliacci together. He was Tonio, of course. Canio. And he had a layover like of 4 or 5 months where he hadn't sung. So he came into rehearsals for Pagliacci sort of not sounding like himself. And he realized that. And he was sitting right next to me in the Sitzprobe, and I was singing the prologue and just knocking everybody's socks off, including his ears. And he said, I'm sorry, kid, I got to get out of here. I can't sing next to you. So he got up and went to the very back of the room, cupped his hand to his ear, and did all of the part in the Sitzprobe. But then he went home for 2 or 3 days and did what he had to do, said his Christian Science prayers, and came back, and he was James McCracken. But in the meantime, while he was gone, we were rehearsing, and we were doing the first act, and I didn't see him there. So we got to the great time where Canio says, ma poi ricordatemi. That's it, isn't it? Oh, then. So there was no one there to sing it, so I just thought, I'll sing it. And then I didn't need to use an extra breath. But as I sang that, what happened? But McCracken walked right through the door. And while I was in the middle of the high B, and I said, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. McCracken. He said, call me Jimmy. I said, I'm sorry, Jimmy. I would never have done that if I'd known you were here. I just did it to fill in because I thought no one was going to sing it. And he said, it's all right, kid. He called me kid. I wasn't a kid. He said, it's all right, kid. It's all right. But you know something, kid? You think you're a baritone, but you're a tenor. I told that to some of my tenor friends, and they said, well, gosh, if you're a tenor, what's that make us? So I don't know if I could have been a tenor if I'd been born with a normal heart and normal lungs. It's possible. I certainly would have had a chance. But with a diseased heart and lungs, I had no chance. I was born with that. I fought that my whole life. But there was no chance for me to make that change to tenor. But I did naturally have those notes. And most of them were there from the very beginning. My first year of singing, 1974, I thought I was a bass baritone. And the reason for that is because I'd been listening to Sieppe records, and I wanted to sound like him. And I sounded pretty good as a bass baritone. That's where I first got hired with the Tulsa Opera. And my first year as an apprentice at Santa Fe was as a bass baritone. That's what they hired me for. But during my study at Santa Fe with two wonderful, wonderful people, Andy and Audrey Langford. Andy White, I studied with him, and he showed me that really I was a baritone, just pretending to sing like a bass baritone. And he was right, and so from that moment on, I sang only baritone material, but occasionally would do a bass role if it suited my voice, like the role of Boris Godunov always suited my voice. Another baritone who did it besides me was Chet Ludgren. Chet Ludgren did it all over the world. I just did it a few times in symphonies. But so there are times when your voice might have a special usage just because the way the part is written. And doesn't mean, though, that you can sing all other bass roles, you know. It just means that one particular role really sat you well, and you could do it. So I could sing the dickens out of Telramund in Lohengrin, because that's a high baritone role, and all my high notes would go right over the orchestra. But I tried to sing Pizarro in Fidelio, and I stunk. It was too low for me. I couldn't have enough volume in that low tessitura to make the impact over the orchestra that I wanted. Oh, you could hear me, but it just didn't have enough impact. And the people were always after me to sing The Dutchman. I said, no, you got the wrong voice. Because the Dutchman sits, again, low for it. You can say bass baritone, but that's not really a proper classification. Wagner wrote these roles for Horbass, meaning a high bass. And that's what the Wotans are written for. That's what the Dutchman is written for. Heinz told me that people were always after him to sing the Dutchman. And he knew the tessitura was just too much. He wouldn't be comfortable at it. So now, we know your tessitura is somewhere in this area. That's A to A, 2 octaves. Somewhere in that area will be your voice if you're a bass or a baritone. The tenor usage of the passaggio, I'm going to talk just a little bit about. I'm not going to do a whole lesson on it, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So the tenore can carry the chest voice normally up to F4. That's F above middle C when we're calling middle C, C4. So the tenor can carry the chest voice up to F, and some very lyric tenors like Gigli up to even F sharp or even G. But Gigli said, I refuse to teach because with my voice I would ruin all of my singers, all of my pupils, because I like to sing the high G open because of my, because of my perfect usage of breath. I can do it, but most tenors would kill them to sing the high G open from the chest. So Pavarotti covered on F sharp. It's a normal place. In the beginning, in the late 40s, early 50s, Delmonico would cover on the F natural, sometimes even on the E. So that Celeste Aida was perfect for Delmonico in the early days because his voice naturally covered on the F natural. Celeste Aida. It naturally wanted to flip over like that. Later on, when he was 20 years older, he began intentionally to push the chest voice on up higher and would sing the F open, the F sharp open, even sometimes the G open. And that's when he had his worst singing. And when he would try to sing Celeste Aida like that, the chest voice would sound nasal, the open F and F sharp would sound sort of weak for him in comparison to the early days. And it was like he gave away the whole voice just to be ready to sing that final Vicino al Sol. If you listen to or watch the video of his Aida from Japan in 1961, when he replaced a colleague who couldn't sing, you'll hear his voice sing like this. He sounds very nasal in the second passage and very little power. Until the end, the final high B flat's terrific. The rest of it's not so terrific. So the tenor has to find out where his passaggio point is specifically according to the tessitura of his voice when he is singing with good resonance. So if we took it at F sharp, of course I would cover before this, but I'm trying to demonstrate as a tenor, the ah vowel would have just a tiny, tiny bit of cover on the F sharp. Sorry. I was trying to put just the tiniest cover. Just the teeny tiniest bit of cover. And then that would allow you to have plenty of elasticity to carry on up the rest of the scale to high C. If you open that F sharp, it would be very difficult. And I'm not going to try to demonstrate that. But so there, that is a very tenorial usage of the voice where F sharp is the cover point. I could sing that in my natural voice and it would sound like a baritone. Now, to show you about my difficulty these days because of lack of breath, it took all of the air in my lungs to sing that phrase. But because I know my technique well, I was able to use every little tiny bit of that breath in my lungs to make a scale which sounded as good at the end as it did at the beginning. So while good technique can cover some things, it cannot cover genuine injuries of the vocal organ. So my power supply, my heart and my lungs, I was born with, deformed and diseased. So I fought and sang in my best part of my career with a damaged power supply. That's one of the, and yet nobody knew it. I didn't tell one soul when I was singing opera that I had a bad heart. I made sure people didn't know that because I didn't want anybody to have the excuse to say, well, we better not use him because, I don't know, might be something bad about our insurance if he's got a bad heart. We better not hire him. So I didn't tell them. I didn't want that excuse to be used. And I can say this honestly, I never disappointed an audience. Out of 400 reviews, only 3 or 4 of them are mixed or negative. The rest of the 400 sounded like your mother or my mother wrote them for me. I mean, they are just glowing reviews, some of which you've seen from my offerings on YouTube. So here we are with the bass, the baritone, and the tenor. And I hope these little tidbits of knowledge have helped you. Two octaves, C to C. Happy singing, happy vocalizing, happy life.